know, within reason, and made it good and artistic, and something that people can climb in and enjoy and have a lot of fun on.
I can't wait to try that out. But before we get to that, tell us what was your inspiration for doing this?
Sure. It was probably around the summer of 2017. I had the idea of doing this installation for our local regional burn called Element 11, and for doing it for the 2019 Element 11, which would be the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. And at that time, it was in July, so our event could be, almost on the 50th anniversary. And so I looked at doing it and talked to some people in the community. And then in 2019, coming into 2019, the community voted our theme for that year to be Trip to the Moon. And so then it was just like, okay, gonna have to do this. And so it became a thing. And we went really big scale and did a lot of work, and I got a good crew, and we built it for Element 11 and then burned it there, though it was moved back to June. But then we rebuilt it and took it to Burning Man to let 80,000 people do it.
Sweet. So a couple weeks ago, I had to rebuild the stairs to my deck or my patio, and I failed miserably at it. There's no possible way I could do anything near this complexity. Like where did your skills come from?
I'm a mechanical engineer, so I do a lot of CAD design all day long. So basically, I just started off with a model of the lunar module that I downloaded off the internet, and it was kind of a toy model. But then I spent a couple months doing research on the Smithsonian NASA sites, looking at photos of the actual lunar modules, and made tweaks to it to come up with as accurate a design as possible. And then went into building, and I have a really, really good welder that's the welding instructor at Highland High School here locally, and a couple of really good carpenter friends that really helped me out with all the woodwork.
Sweet. You want to show us around it a little
bit?
Sure.
Yeah. So the way we usually run this is we funnel people through the back, starting in the art gallery underneath, and we're going through there.
And now we're going to go to the next segment.
These first two panels are all of Alan Bean's artwork. He was the fourth astronaut to walk on the moon. And after he retired in the early 80s, he just became a full-time artist and just painted his memories of going into space.
Oh, that's so cool. Another art-space connection there. It's
right.
Amazing.
A really good story that I like from Apollo 12, where he went on the moon with Pete Conrad. He smuggled up a camera timer to take a picture of the two of them, but didn't tell any of the administrators. So they would come back with their camera rolls with a picture of the two of them together, but they couldn't find the camera timer while they were on their moonwalk. So this is his photo of what that picture would have looked like.
Oh, okay.
Wow, that's awesome.
Space selfie.
Yeah.
So that would be is there anyone else that's not in that photo that was on the moon at the time?
No. Only two people land on the moon each time. We went to the moon 6 times, so we've had 12 moonwalkers.
So every person living on Earth at that time is in that photo, or in that painting?
No, okay, not quite, because Dick Gordon was in orbit. In the command module around the moon. So that's everyone in humanity minus one. So these are
the opposite of
these are the pictures from E11. This is the installation at E11, and then that's during the burn that we did. That was in June of 2019. These photos are from on one of my Facebook space pages. Someone said that they were going to Burning Man and posted this, and so I invited him to post his art in the lunar module. His name's David Alvarez from Mexico City. I really liked his style and form, so I'm honored to have it be part of the installation.
Yeah, and you may have seen our logo. We take a bit of inspiration from the space program.
Oh yeah.
So Oasis Cafe, what's the acronym?
Oasis Cafe, yeah, the acronym. I'm going to cheat here. So that is the each letter represents the name of one of the lunar modules that flew in space. So going down the list is Orion, Aquarius, Spider, Intrepid, Snoopy, Challenger, Antares, Falcon, and Eagle. So
Nice.
each one of those were one of these that flew in space with people flying in it.
Cool.
And then this is a sculpture that we did just before going off to the burn last summer. And this is the main descent engine, pretty much to scale of the engine bell that they used to land on the moon.
So this would just like blast fire out to control
Mhm.
the landing?
So yeah, and this was actually one of the very first throttleable engines ever created, where they
Wow.
could control, how much they could adjust their thrust from like 10 to 100%, which they needed to be able to, soft land on the moon.
Cool.
It's a little bit better than the new system where they fill up balloons and let it bounce.
Oh, right.
Like the Mars lander.
Yeah. Yeah. So then from here, we have access to go up into the main astronaut area, or the main cabin, or the ascent stage.
Mhm.
And so what we see here is left on the moon each time what we're inside of. So there's 6 of these. That's all the steel part here is all sitting on the moon. It's 6 different locations still. And then what's above us, that's all wood, is the ascent stage, and that's what launches back up and goes back into orbit and then returns to Earth. Well, that doesn't return to Earth, just the people do.
Mhm.
Cool. Let's go
Neat.
check it out up there.
Yeah.
Let's ascend.
And the third.
So at the events like Element 11 in the burn, do you just camp out up here?
So we had 2 different configurations. For Element 11, I actually created it to have, and we had walls in here that created the actual astronaut space. And so there was a bulkhead right around here. And so this basically is the full astronaut space right here.
Wow.
And then there is a step up just this high, and then a hallway going straight back here, and then it goes up to the port that would connect to the command module.
Cool.
So really, this is the whole space that they had. And
For the entire mission?
well, they're only in this spacecraft for a couple days.
Okay.
They're in the command module has a lot more space.
Mm-hmm.
But on Apollo 11, they were there for 22 hours and had a sleep period, and they didn't give them any. They just had to deal with it. And so Neil Armstrong actually there was an engine right here, so he sat in this hallway on this engine cover and just leaned back and slept. And Buzz Aldrin just laid on the floor right there.
Wow.
And slept. In future missions, they were there longer, and they developed a hammock system.
So this was when they were on the moon, right?
On
so
the
there
moon.
was gravity.
So there was.
Why are they complaining? There's no gravity.
Right. No, there is 1/6 gravity.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I guess that wouldn't put as many knots in your back if you're.
Right. Yeah. So you actually probably could sleep in a hammock just fine.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, but then for the burn, I decided there's going to be a lot more people coming through here.
Yeah.
We want to make it a lot more friendly. So we just opened it up, added some nice carpeting, and yeah, it was a really nice chill space. And we had up to 12 people up here at a time. So
Yeah. Before COVID.
right. Right. Before COVID. So there usually is a roof, but half the time we would have it open, and so to have stargazing. You can see the hinges we have here. It was damaged, and we're still refabricating it. But then we always left that back port open so we could look out, and people could just get a good view from up high.
Yeah.
At the burn, did it like really strike a lot of conversations about space? And
Well, what
everything?
I really liked about what was really fascinating to me about having this at the burn, which I didn't expect, was that it brought my people to me. So some people would just be biking by and be like, "Oh, that's cool," and swing by. But then people that knew what it was would come in and just start talking and be super passionate about it, and just have these deep conversations about the Apollo missions and humanity's journey into the stars, and it was really, really fun.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So, what was your inspiration? Like, what compelled you to do this?
Well, I've always had an affinity for, space, and I remember watching the first shuttle launch with my dad when I was a kid, and hearing him talk all about, seeing the moon landings and stuff. And my dad's an engineer and has done some work in the space program early as well. So he, kind of passed it on to me, and I just took off with it. But it wasn't until like the last, few years as the anniversary was approaching that I really kind of grasped onto it and got passionate about it.
So do you have a favorite NASA science story?
One of my favorite ones is regarding the lunar module, and when they were developing it, they planned to have seats and good-sized windows, because that's how every spaceship is ever designed. And some of the engineers that were working on the development of it, I think this was a Grumman, they told their boss, like, we don't need seats, there's not that much gravity, we can just make little windows and have them stand. And their boss was just like, that's not an option, we can't do that. So the engineer stayed up all night and made a cardboard mock-up of their idea, and in the morning their boss came in and like, what do you think of this? And the boss walked up and looked out the windows. He's like, he just saved us thousands of pounds, and this is what we're gonna do.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, I mean, just the innovation and 400,000 engineers working full time for years to get us on the moon is just completely mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So the next question that falls from that is, how much time and money did you have to put into this thing exactly?
A lot of time and a lot of money. I have some other friends that do big art projects, and their consummate answer is they don't like to say how much they spent because they'd be embarrassed by like the number. But one thing I can tell you is, if you read this book, it talks about in Apollo 8, they sent up little bottles of brandy for Christmas Day, because the first day we went around the moon, not landing. This is the first time we went around the moon, was on the Christmas Day 1968. And so for Christmas, their Christmas meal, they set up little bottles of brandy, but their commander, Frank Borman, wouldn't allow them to open it because they're just like, we're too professional for that. So Jim Lovell held on to his, and in 2008 he auctioned it off, and this cost more than what that bottle of brandy was for.
You'll have to buy the book Alcohol in Space by Chris Carberry to find out a ballpark figure there.
Yeah.
Can I tell you my favorite science story from NASA?
Please.
So, because of course it relates to bathroom, because I'm a child and I love potty humor. But so they didn't know how to set up a bathroom system for the astronauts. And so the best idea they came up with, because they're all men, was a condom system.
Of course. So
they would have like a little condom that let the pee go out. And they kept having pee all over the module, and they couldn't figure out what it was. Problem was, and this is from Mary Roach's book, Packing for Mars, so it's fact-checked.
Mm-hmm.
The doctors didn't measure the astronauts. They just left it to self-report. So of course they're like, yeah, I need an extra large condom for my
astronaut. I'm a test pilot.
Yeah.
For you guys here. So let me show you, you can stand up there. We're going to be filling this up with instrumentation, and I'll show you what our instrumentation is. It's still getting cleaned up and refurbished from the burn, because it was we have old broken pieces of mixers and music boards that have been donated by various DJs and music friends. And so this whole thing gets covered in 15 of these all over the place, to have all the switches and dials and stuff, and people can just come up and play with it.
Oh, that's fun.
So that's on its way. A lot of the details that are going to be getting finished up here.
And that's probably actually higher tech than the actual stuff that was in the module.
It probably is. It probably is, especially some of the nice mix boards
Yeah.
and loopers and stuff. So this is my very favorite Japanese whiskey. It's Suntory Haikushu. And another thing that I literally just learned this week from reading Alcohol in Space is that Suntory has been doing alcohol fermentation research on the ISS.
Oh, cool.
They and Ardbeg out of Scotland are two of the major distillers that have scientists up there doing some alcohol fermentation research.
Neat.
So I was just completely blown away.
Yeah.
So this is a special treat that I took out to the burn and had some of this at the burn.
Cheers.
And you didn't even know that they were doing research then?
I didn't.
Sweet.
Cheers.
Cheers.
That's smooth.
So good. So good.
Nice.
And yeah, cheers to you. Thank you so much for building this.
Thanks.
And like, if it wasn't for the artists doing this kind of having these visions and putting their time and money and resources into this, like, we wouldn't have these great things. So
Yeah, and so keep an eye out for what's going to be going on to the art garden. You mentioned at the beginning, and I'm working with some of the other people in charge here. We're going to be definitely working on getting other art installations here and having some type of outdoor art walk that people can come through and check out these, somewhat interactive, depending on where we are in the world at the time, and becoming more interactive as things start to ease. But if you want to come see it, we'll figure it out.
Definitely. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
I'm tired of holding this camera. Cheers.
Cheers.
Okay. Let's turn that off. There. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back.
That was really cool.
thank you. So
Chris, real quick, do you know off the top of your head how much that bottle of brandy was worth?
I believe it was about $18,000, if I'm remembering correctly. Hold on a second.
Wait.
I can just look that up quickly. Yeah, 1 second. All right, let's see. There it is. Where did I put the price? $17,925 at auction. Yeah.
God damn.
It was, of course, one of these mini bottles of brandy. So just a tiny one. But they also got, a card, an authentication card signed by Jim Lovell. And there was something else that went along with it also. I just can't remember what. But yeah, so $18,000.
God damn.
Well, there aren't too many of those around. I don't know what
not at
others
all.
do. So it may well be the only bottle of brandy that's ever orbited the moon.
That's crazy. It's absolutely bananas. It's really cool.
Wow. So let me forgot to introduce Chris Carberry. He is the author of Alcohol in Space, the book that our friend Jeremy was reading and learning all the stuff about alcohol in space and the Japanese whiskey that's doing research up there. So tell us more, Chris. What's the story of alcohol in space?
Well, first off, thanks for having me on. This is a lot of fun. Well, like all good stories and all good books, this started off in a bar. So my day job is CEO of a nonprofit called Explore Mars. Before then, I was the executive director of the Mars Society. And for years, of course, after events, as space folks do, they go to bars after events, after a few drinks, sometimes the conversation goes to, shifts to things like, what would wine taste like if you made it on Mars? Would it taste like the soil of Mars? And could you brew beer on the moon, et cetera, et cetera? And over time, I had enough of these conversations, as pathetic as that sounds, and thought this might make a really amusing article, based on real science, but just something that's lighthearted. But the more and more I looked at it, the more I kept finding real companies, real individuals or organizations that were actually investigating whether you could manufacture and consume alcohol in space. Plus, there's a fascinating history as well. As we just heard one of the stories, with Apollo 8. Well, they didn't drink that brandy, but just a few months later, there was an alcoholic beverage consumed on the surface of the moon by none other than Buzz Aldrin.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he drank wine. He had arranged with his church, the Webster Presbyterian Church in Houston, to do a communion ceremony. Say a few prayers and do a communion drink. So they provided him with a little goblet and wine. And he asked permission, I believe, Deke Slayton, but Deke didn't want him to do it publicly. He wanted to do it right for his public statement, right after Neil made his public statement, right after they landed. Buzz wanted to do the communion, but Deke Slayton asked him, "Why don't you wait until after the radio is off?" They were very concerned because during that Apollo 8 mission, there was a lot of controversy from some well-known atheists that they read from the book of Genesis in the Bible when they were going. You may recall Christmas Eve to reading, from, in the beginning. And so that created quite a bit of controversy. So they were afraid if Buzz were actually reading prayers and drinking alcohol, that would even create a bigger stir. But to this point, I think Buzz Aldrin is probably still the only person to have consumed an alcoholic beverage on another planetary body other than Earth.
Goodness, that's amazing. So what is NASA's official stance on alcohol in space?
There is no alcohol in space.
Oh, okay. I had no idea.
Nobody would ever do that.
Just like Utah. We might as well be in Utah if we're on the moon.
Yeah. So you're right. So just consider ISS, Utah in space. Yeah. And so it is officially prohibited. But, it's with big, quotes. It's every space agency officially prohibits alcohol in space, some more willingly than others. Part of this was also through a lot of pressure from the United States, but nonetheless, it is prohibited. But over the years, we know it has happened, and happened quite a bit. But the funny thing is, I've never heard of any stories where any astronauts were inebriated in space. They always do this responsibly. They don't smuggle up a lot, but it's just enough for special circumstances, special events. If a new crew comes up, they'll get together, have a little reception, and have, sip little shots of cognac. And I believe I saw in your questions, so I'm probably going to run through a lot of your questions before you ask them, but cognac is actually a drink of choice in space. Everybody when people hear that I wrote a book on alcohol in space, they'll often say, I bet there's a lot of vodka in space. And there has been vodka in space, I believe, but cognac became quickly the preferred beverage, and by the Russians, and then, to everybody else as well, because the Russians are the ones who brought it up there. So, not just it was on the Mir space station, of course, but it's also on the International Space Station in the Russian segment. But even during the Mir days, when the space shuttle docked to it, there were stories of the alcohol floating over into the space shuttle as well. Occasion.
How do you drink alcohol in space? Can I ask that?
Through your mouth.
Do you have to be upside down or something?
Yeah. You can drink it anyway, but of course with microgravity, it makes it really challenging. And you've all seen the images of astronauts spraying water bottles and you have these little orbs of water. Well, the same thing with most of the alcoholic beverages. You either drink it out of a spray bottle, a sippy cup, or something like that, or you spray it into the air. It creates this little orb kind of pulsating in the air, and then they sip it in. And this is kind of one of the common ways they do these toasts in space. So you have these floating balls of cognac, which they sip in. But
sippy cups. I'm still like hung up on the idea of sippy cups.
I understand more.
So it's like a sippy cup. It's like.
I understand more that I have to go to parties and like have a mask on and like drink. Like it makes way more sense now.
Hey, see that could work. So,
is there a specific brand of cognac that is the drink of choice, or?
You know what? I don't know the answer to that one. I should. I will look that up. I haven't. Actually, I do. There is in the book. I do. I can't remember. I do refer to a story that it's the same actual story as when it actually floated over to the space shuttle when some of the astronauts went back to Space Hab in the back cargo bay of the space shuttle. This one isn't even a secret story. This was actually depicted in an official NASA oral history of this particular astronaut. I'm not even going to mention names, even though it's in the public domain right now. But it's there in the book, and if I feel motivated to look it up during this interview.
No worries.
But I mean, regarding drinking, there are, but because alcohol producers like the ambiance, like drinking authentically. When you're drinking, of course, I'm drinking out of a bottle, but many of you are drinking out of glasses. And I drink wine, I drink scotch, and of course, I drink them out of glasses, not out of the bottle. They're much better that way. And so a lot of not a lot of them, but a number of alcohol producers are producing glasses as well. There's actually a company that's produced a scotch glass. There's also a company that's produced a cocktail glass. And I actually have a 3D model of one of them. I know it kind of looks like a gourd, but
yeah.
See, it's an interesting project because, and this one was actually given to me by private astronaut Richard Garriott. Richard Garriott was one of the fourth, fifth? I can't remember which number he was. He was supposed to be the first private astronaut in space, but then that got delayed. But, Richard and I spoke at the Explorers Club on this topic in New York back in December, back in the early times before the pandemic, when we could all get together in person. And he had this specially 3D printed because he was part of that project. And basically what they want to do is create a cocktail glass where you could actually sip it in space more authentically. And since kind of one of the parts of fluid dynamics in space, apparently fluids will adhere to surfaces, but you still need to channel them somehow. And so they created this system with these grooves. I'm not sure if you can see that. Whoops, strung right. Yep. And so they would fill it. There's no hole here, but they would fill it from the bottom, and the liquid would come up and come through the grooves. So you would be able to sip it as it was filling up these grooves. So this is designed for drinking cocktails or any other drink, really, in microgravity. But they're not the only ones. There are actually several others, that have done this. And once again, I don't want to keep talking before you can ask questions, but. There's a champagne company also, and we can talk about some other elements of the champagne company in a second, but that also developed a glass because they wanted to enhance the conviviality of drinking their product in space. They were thinking forward to space hotels. Well, if they're going to be space hotels, they're going to be drinking champagne, and we can't have them squirting it out into the air. And so they wanted to create this special glass, and they even tested it on a zero-G flight, actually the European version of a zero-G flight. And I believe they've tested it twice, in the last few years.
Nice. Is that you're showing us? Is that tested in the field?
Sorry. What was that again?
the cocktail glass that you showed us, the 3D printed one, has that been tested in microgravity?
Not on a. They had hoped at the time, and they've started up again because they started this a number of years ago. They had a crowdsourcing campaign, didn't fund very well, got a lot of press. They shut down for a little while, but it's also they've started up again. Actually, thanks to for some reason, there's been a little more attention to alcohol in space lately, which stimulated them to start the project up again. So they haven't tested this on a zero-G flight. They hope to. I believe they did some drop tests with it to test, the fluid channeling capabilities. But that's still, the physics is there, but it's really quick. And so not nearly as fun as going on a zero-G flight and out your glasses. So,
Yeah.
So do you think the recent increase in interest for alcohol in space has anything to do with the recent creation of the United States Space Force?
well, I don't. This predates that. Space Force thing, meaning people have been pondering it for a number of years. It's actually not something that was kind of thought of just in the last few years, but I don't think it has anything to do with that. Of course, the U.S. military also, the Navy. Navy is the best kind of analogy to Space Force. And the Navy is not too fond of having alcohol on their ships, kind of like NASA. They do allow it in some circumstances when there's a deployment for a long period of time, at a very, very minimal level. But I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think it has to do more with probably all the enthusiasm with commercial space. And I think growing realization that we're finally going to start exploring. You have all these different elements, architectural elements, rocket companies, different companies all over the world and the country that are really working on remarkable things. And so we are closer to finally achieving these goals than we ever have been. And now the people are thinking of, well, if we're going to have space tourism, if people are going to be living and working in space, they're not going to be living some, just sterile environment and just like some NASA poster. They're going to be living life once. And this is kind of the real way you define whether you go from just a settlement or a civilization. If you're always at work 24 hours a day like astronauts, and there's reasons why there's prohibition in space. I'm not arguing with all the points because they are responsible for the lives of the people on the spaceship, and they're at work 24 hours a day, essentially. But when we're sending tourists up and others, they're not going to be at work for 24 hours a day. They're going to have off time, and most of them hopefully won't be responsible for the lives of everybody else on the ship, on the colony. And so they're going to want to do things like have a drink or, do other things as well. There are other, for instance, I consider there are two big taboos in space exploration: alcohol in space and sex in space.
Oh man, those are the best.
And so I dealt with one of them. I'm probably not going to deal with the other, but nonetheless, but these things, this is what happens, of course, when you're trying to build real settlements, colonies, civilization in space. Without these things, you don't actually have civilization.
Yeah.
The second one. So,
as you're kind of describing this kind of future scenario of kind of these astronauts that aren't working 24/7, I was kind of picturing scenes from Space Odyssey 2001, where these space stations are more like airports and people are coming in and out casually in their business suits rather than in spacesuits, and they get drinks and it's way more relaxed. Is that kind of something how you see this developing in the future?
I do. I think, first off, like when companies like, I think eventually like that, that's a big facility when you have something like that. But of course, you're going to have that. But even when people are going up like this balloon company, Worldview, they're not technically in space, they're thinking of having a drink. I suspect when like Virgin or others start going up, particularly when they get beyond low Earth orbit, when they're just going up for 3 minutes of 3 minutes of weightlessness, you may not want to waste your time, your 3 minutes of weightlessness and your view of the earth from above, opening a drink and drinking it, because you'd lose all your time. But once people are really spending time, and as space hotels or other places, of course that's going to be part of it. They're going to really want to do this, in a classy way. Make sure they're getting their money's worth. Of course, going into space is certainly your money's worth, but they really want to make it into an amazing experience. And having a toast in space, with your fellow tourists in orbit or on the moon or Mars would be quite remarkable.
Yeah, that's really cool. So alcohol is, or at least in its liquid form, is pretty heavy. It's not really practical to carry in long space travel. So I know in your book you kind of allude to manufacturing alcohol in space rather than carrying it along. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah. Now, as you mentioned, of course, it's not practical to carry a lot of alcohol. I mean, every ounce, every pound, it's heavy, and you just can only bring so much. And you do need the important supplies first, like your food and your water and your fuel and your oxygen. But over time, of course, they are going to be able to live off the land. And they'll be able to manufacture those other things as well, manufacture their water, oxygen, fuel. They'll be able to start growing food. But once you're able to start growing food, it creates certain options. Now, it's not very efficient to make alcohol out of your food crops, but over time, they're going to start doing it, first in small amounts. They're going to have, we maybe allot some of it and we'll have a drink once in a while. But over time, as they get better and better at this, there's no question, they're going to start manufacturing alcohol. And it'll be interesting to see, because on Earth, we use a very small number of crops for our alcohol, and they're good. We know that they work really well, but it's still, of the options for making alcohol on this planet, we use a very, very, very small number of options. And of course, have the drinks that we are accustomed to drinking. But maybe when we're on Mars or the moon or somewhere else, different crops might actually be better suited. And, it'll be interesting to see if new forms of alcohol develop, that because of different crops you use, or how is it going to be affected in the 1/3 gravity of Mars or the 1/6 gravity of the moon. And so it'll be really interesting. Maybe we'll use algae. Maybe we'll use other things. I mentioned in the book, things, just weird, stranger crops that we use on Earth, not too often, but that people will do just to try it. Like I saw there was a Japanese company using radishes. There was like someone that made an alcoholic beverage out of lettuce, and they grow lettuce up on the International Space Station. So they theoretically could, I suppose, turn that into some form of alcohol. Just any sort of biomass you could theoretically, particularly as long as you can access the sugars, you can turn it into an alcohol product. So that would be the fascinating thing to see. What, not only will they manufacture alcohol, but what type of alcohol is most likely to be made, and which crops lend themselves to it the most.
That's cool. So in the story, The Martian, or in the book, The Martian, by Andy Weir, who actually wrote the foreword to your book, which is really cool, I think. But Mark Watney, the main character, grows potatoes in his Martian soil, supplemented with some homemade fertilizer. Do you believe it would have been practical or realistic for him to make any alcohol out of his pooped potatoes?
Yes. I mean, it wouldn't have been a smart idea by Mark Watney, because if you saw him towards the end, he was kind of skeletal. So he would have been far more skeletal if he started making vodka. But the whole concept, potatoes on Mars, is realistic. There's actually even a group that's a partnership between NASA Ames and the International Potato Center. Yes, there is such a thing in Lima, Peru, called potatoes on Mars. Potatoes on Mars, trying to see, which varieties of potatoes might be best suited for Mars. And because Peru is like the capital of potatoes, I mean, there are literally, I believe, 2,000 or more, maybe I may be understating it a lot, but many thousands of varieties of potatoes. Some of them grow in extremely harsh environments, meaning at high altitudes, cold weather. So they've been experimenting on this, trying Martian simulant, trying different atmospheric pressures and temperatures to see how harsh an environment, how close to Mars they can get. They don't imagine they're going to grow potatoes out in the open, because it's not suitable out in the atmosphere on Mars. However, if you can find a way to grow potatoes or other crops in an atmosphere pressure that is not suitable for humans, but you can grow your food without, with less energy, less effort, that would be very interesting. It would save a lot of resources if you could, you didn't have to pressurize your greenhouses, which would take up a lot of space. So if you didn't have to pressurize them as much and bring them up to what's suitable for human beings, that would be good. But if you can make potatoes, getting back to the original question, of course, you can make vodka. And so, but, other things, if, there are a lot of other crops I've talked about that might be suitable. I mean, I've heard asparagus would be, I'm not quite sure what kind of alcohol you'd be making with asparagus. And
I don't know about how I feel about that.
That brings up some troubling other issues as well. But
so I was actually thinking about this because I read through your book in the past week or so, and we have our clearly defined. We've got beer, we've got wine, champagne, our spirits. These are our terrestrial type alcoholic beverages, but all of these kind of came out of accident and discovery over tens of thousands of years through human civilization. So I'm thinking that when we go up into space and we start producing alcohol in space, it is going to be unlike anything we have here on Earth. Like, they're going to be completely new, unique beverages. You're not going to have like a Budweiser in space because you can't grow barley. I mean, at least right now, we can't practically grow enough barley for that. So do you have any ideas of what some of these maybe strange, or I know you said asparagus and lettuce, and I don't know.
I don't actually. As I said, it's going to really depend on where, when we're really there, figuring out what the crops will be. We've tested things. There have been many projects, including there in Utah. One of these beer projects, Mars beer projects, was actually at the Mars Desert Research Station in Hanksville. The Mars Society runs that facility. And Crew 149, I believe it was, did an experiment using Mars stimulant where they experiment growing hops and sorghum. And with the intent, maybe can we brew beer on Mars? The first step would be there if you could, grow the crops that you need for beer on Mars. And it worked. They were able to grow the crops. They realized, and this wasn't a revelation, they knew they would need to add nutrients, but they started off with the raw stimulant, and it grew to a certain level and then stopped. Then, of course, once they added nutrients, which you'd need to do in the Martian soil because there'd be no nutrients, it grew pretty well. So we don't know. I mean, there have been many other experiments around the world with simulated Mars soil, simulated lunar soil, and it appears that you can grow things in these in this soil. And so, but that's the real test. How accurate are these simulants? The Mars simulant, okay, but it's also lacking things like some of the toxins, like perchlorates, these salts that are toxic. And then I'm sure there are other factors as well. So it's hard to say, but based on what we know now, the potato is actually probably, for an alcoholic producing product, probably one of the best ones. But, based on that experiment with sorghum, I think I've seen barley and hops, beer would probably, from a pure simplicity of the brewing process, probably beer is the most sensible, just because it only requires really, it's a simple process. Whereas
you just got to ferment.
With if you're doing distilled alcohol, you have to ferment, then distill. And with wine, it's more elaborate. You still only really distill. I mean, not distill, ferment, but it's not just that simple. And you have to get the grapes as well, which grapevines are a little more complicated than some of these other crops.
So talking about vines, another, like we mentioned hops a little bit. So a lot of these varietal type crops are, they get a lot of their characteristics from the soil and their environment that they're in. So are we anticipating that, we're going to have Syrah grapes on Mars that have their distinct characteristics that is completely separate from everything we see here on our terrestrial Earth?
It'll be, I'm sure something will happen. Of course, Earth grapes will be brought, vines will be brought. But over time, they may probably mutate, and over time, they will become indigenous Martian grape varieties. And so, but as you mentioned, with basically the absorbing the taste of the soil, which is called terroir, when you have the taste of the region, the mineralogy from the ground in which the grapes are grown, that's terroir. And this was actually part of the basis of my original discussions at bars when we were talking about, would it taste rusty, because Mars is essentially rusty. And of course, I think it was actually Penny Boston, well-known NASA scientist, who came up with the phrase Marswar. That can't be terroir because that's Earth, but Marswar, if it's and I expanded that in the book for the moon, Lunoir.
Can I ask a question? I want to know more about this partnership with Ardbeg, because I looked up the experiment they did, and you can talk more about this. But after they sent the single malt Scotch whiskey into space, one of the people described the aftertaste as pungent, intense, and long, with hints of wood, antiseptic lozenges, and rubbery smoke. So even things that are made on Earth, taste different after they've been in space.
Yes, and so that was an interesting one. And let me get a little backstory on how we got to know Ardbeg. This was one of these happy coincidences. Ardbeg was my favorite Scotch before I knew they had anything to do with space. I love big, peaty, smoky Scotches. So Ardbeg's one of the smokiest Scotches on the market. And I happened to be looking at their Facebook page one Friday evening while sipping Ardbeg appropriately. And it was covered with space pictures. And I thought this was really weird. Why is a Scotch company, why does their Facebook page have space pictures all over it? And so I started researching and realized they had sent up this aging experiment launched in 2011. And there were all these coincidences, can't quite say it. They sent it up with nanoracks, and it was just coincidental that I had a long phone call with the president of that company, Jeffrey Manber, just earlier that day, and one of my board members with Explore Mars had had lunch with them, and they just found all these connections. And so I reached out to Ardbeg, and probably within a week they had agreed to become our Scotch sponsor for the Mars Summit every year. And I think that's been since 2014 that they've been our Scotch sponsor, and they've been a very, very strong supporters of this book as well.
Man, I gotta find myself a Scotch sponsor.
Yeah, they're not my only alcohol sponsor. I've managed to line up a lot of my favorite alcohols as sponsors, so it's just happy coincidences. But with this experiment, this was kind of put together really quickly, and they wanted to see how it aged, whiskey aged in space. Of course, they can't send a barrel into space. They use, and so they use these mix sticks that NanoRacks has for, essentially mixing experiments or things in space. And they use these shavings from oak barrels, and they sent them up, but stayed up there much longer. It was a quickly developed experiment, and it stayed up there much longer than they had hoped. And it came back down. It wasn't, didn't really think about all the shaking and everything that's associated with launch and landing and handling. And so, yes, the ground sample tasted a lot different than the space sample. And the space sample wasn't necessarily an improvement on the ground sample. But, and, I think one person, I mentioned David Blackmore, who's the brand ambassador here in the United States, is mentioned it tasted a bit fishy, which is not one of the qualities you want in your scotch. And so, I mean, literally fishy, not just curious, but tasted like fish. So, and so, at least not what I want in my scotch. But one of the things they were wondering, it may not be because it was developed so quickly and it stayed up there longer. It may have been because of other factors, not inherently because of aging in space, but because of all these other shaking factors, the handling, probably went through a lot of extreme heat changes as well. Any number of things could have actually had that impact on the scotch. However, as was mentioned in your video earlier, Suntory actually sent up a couple of experiments for aging as well. And they conceived of it in 2011 also. I assume it's probably because Ardbeg sent something up. I don't know that for sure, but it's awfully coincidental. But they took a number of years to think it through and develop it. And so they sent two, I don't know if it's two, but two sets at least of experiments. One has already returned, but they have been pretty close-lipped. And I reached out to them a number of times, and they did answer some questions, but they only answered the questions that didn't really answer much. But they still have an experiment up there aging. So it'll be really interesting to see what the results of these experiments are. I mean, I hope they're going to release the results of the one that came back at some point, because it'd be really interesting. But they may be, once again, they may have some real business reasons for keeping it secret to see if it's something that they can use to their advantage to get some sort of competitive edge in the future.
That's pretty interesting. I like, so I know like with barrel aging, any sort of spirit, like part of the flavor comes from the contact with the wood. And then the other part of the flavor comes through the process of oxygenation throughout time, because the wood kind of acts as a conduit between the outside world and what's inside of there. So I'm interested because like I've used barrel chips before when I'm brewing, and you definitely get a barrel flavor, but it's not quite the same as something sitting in a barrel. So I don't know. Yeah, like you said, it'll be interesting to see what they actually come out with that research. But
yeah, and I know at Ardbeg, last time I spoke to them, they were also considering doing a follow-on experiment and something that was more authentic. I mean, I don't know what that means. Does that mean making little teeny barrels that they can send up? I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see what they do to make it more authentic in the aging, but also to protect it from all the other factors, protect it from the, there are ways to at least offset the shaking, but also protect it from, once again, all these other factors. I mean, there are a lot of sensitive experiments that go up to ISS, so they do have practices for protecting, like pharmaceutical experiments and everything else.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So talking on alcohol still, fermentation in space, fermentation in microgravity, I'm sure that has its own unique complications. I was just kind of thinking through this process as I was reading through your book, and here on Earth we've got gravity, the constant influence of gravity in any sort of fermenting beverage or any sort of fermenting substance. Your sugar water is more dense than your alcohol water, so it's always down at the bottom with your yeast cake. In microgravity, I would assume that the yeast cells kind of create a pocket around them of this more alcohol content stuff, because there's no influence of gravity to like give them more food. So I would expect fermentation to be a little bit tricky in microgravity without any sort of like centrifuge or some sort of like rotation to keep artificial gravity there.
Yeah, and there have been some fermentation experiments. Now, I'm not going to say I'm an expert on all of what's gone on, but even back in the early 90s, there were a couple of experiments that went up. I mentioned this in the book. This actually a graduate student named Kristen. What's her last name?
Oh yeah, badass women in science, right there.
Yeah, and regardless, it was a partnership from BioServe, I think, and Coors, actually. And they sent up 2 experiments, and it was partially yeast experiment, but I believe they did some fermentation. They did find that there was some changes in the yeast also than would have happened on Earth, but after a few generations back on Earth, kind of went back to normal. And I know some others have done it, but it's still been limited as far as I know, and I think there's still a lot of mystery on if you're really going to brew, and particularly brew in volume and not tiny little amounts. What it's really going to be like. But as you mentioned, those factors are really important, and it may well ferment. But once again, you might get completely different results. Once you may have just by accident have an entirely new variety of alcohol that you develop, and can you imagine though, like how much that would go for? The first indigenous brand of whatever, whether it be something we know like whiskey or beer or wine made in space, made on Mars or the moon, or something completely new. Think what that would go for here on Earth.
Yeah.
We thought that the little bottle of brandy was $18,000 was expensive, but there are rare bottles of wine and scotch and other things that just go for a lot more than that, that the collectors get. If you got the very first bottle of Martian wine or a lunar scotch, that wouldn't be scotch because it's not made in Scotland, but whiskey, that would be something. I bet somebody would spend millions for that.
Easily. So early on in your book, you talk a lot about different examples of alcohol in science fiction. And one of them was a space station that doubled as a brewery, I believe.
Oh yeah, that slingshot. That was
slingshot. Yeah.
Was that David Brin or was that? It's terrible. I should remember that. And yeah, so basically what they did within that, there was a short story, and basically, they realized this was, a product that they weren't going to make a lot of money on, but it was something unique. They had a facility that was in one of these expended fuel tanks that they had, were utilizing for the space station for creating this slingshot beer, which, when people were coming up, the military or others, everybody demanded some of this and, became very popular. But you can see how that would happen, that the first time it was being created or manufactured, it would be at a very small level, very micro brewery, micrograph brewery. I think you can see this happening. I think that it's going to happen like this, and it'll become if people can brew enough, not enough to manufacture and sell in volume. But I can see it happening on space stations everywhere else. It's something, if you know the right person, you get to go and try this. The only beer or the only whiskey or moonshine or Martian or whatever. Being made indigenously.
Interesting. So how long do you think it'll be before we see practical, production of alcohol in space?
Practical, it's going to take a while. Once again, you need to get accomplished at manufacturing, growing crops. Just without the crops, you're not going to make your alcohol. So you have to have enough excess beyond what you need to eat to be able to justify making it in larger quantities. As I said earlier, there's no question, even before they've perfected it, people are going to make small quantities of alcohol. It's just that's human nature. It's going to happen. There's another story, all the beer on Mars. That was Benford, Gregory Benford, and that was basically on a trip to Mars, searching for life. They brought some yeast and the rest of the other ingredients. I think it was barley and obviously hops. And they ate small quantities, and they toasted when they found life on Mars. They toasted, to all the beer on Mars. But you can see that happening, but that's in small quantities. So I think over time, as we really can build up a society, real permanence, in space, that's when it's going to happen, and that's when indigenous brewing, distilling will happen. But there's a lot of great momentum for that because, and this is one of the things I'm most excited about with all the interest from the alcohol industry. And we haven't really talked about, we talked about Ardbeg and Centauri, but there are a lot of other companies looking at this right now, including big behemoths of companies like Budweiser.
Yeah.
Budweiser announced at South by Southwest in 2017 they wanted to be the first beer manufacturer on Mars. And that wasn't just a PR stunt. They've already sent, 4 barley experiments up to ISS. But the funny thing is that goes well beyond making beer or whiskey. That is a direct investment in agriculture.
Absolutely.
So when you have companies like this, not just alcohol companies, but companies that are investing in these technologies that benefit their product, but also have a lot of other side benefits, that's where you're going to get this innovation and these just more efficient ways of doing things. And I think that's what's going to make it happen as people are looking at it in this context that, they're investing, and yes, we want to be able to make food, but they're looking at it so they can make larger quantities. And I think this will be the key. You need enough people there to justify making the alcohol, all the crops. But I think with all these investments, and as I said, it's also not just Budweiser, but there's also other companies. I mentioned that champagne company, Maison Mumm, multiple smaller beer companies. What's the other? There's one that's kind of escaping me right now.
Is it the Ninkasi?
Yeah, well, Ninkasi is one of them. Ninkasi from Oregon, they did from suborbit. They did a sounding rocket experiment with yeast, and then created ground control beer based on manufactured from that yeast that had been in space. So I think this is all really interesting. And that's the thing I was going to mention. There's also Bordeaux, I can't remember which wine company, but there are 12 bottles of Bordeaux up on the International Space Station right now. So the wine industry is looking at this also. So I think it's all great. And I think the more they're looking at this to benefit their product, also benefits the ability for humans to live and work in space. Because essentially what I articulate in the book, everything you need to do to be able to manufacture alcohol in space is essentially the same things you need to do to sustain human presence in space. Yep. And so they go hand in hand, they complement each other. So I think this is the real trick, is just getting all these companies invested so they can make some great things happen to go well beyond their products.
Yeah, I think it's like you mentioned, there's a lot of more interest in all of the space alcohol recently, and you said it was, these private space companies. So you've got Virgin Galactic and SpaceX, and was it Blue Horizons or whatever? And I think
Blue Origin.
Yeah, Blue Origin. Yeah, they the rise of these companies, and it's been really like in the past 10, 15 years. And you look at SpaceX 15 years ago versus what they're doing now. It's just it's bananas. So I can absolutely see, in our lifetime, seeing alcohol manufacturing in space.
Oh, absolutely. And as I said, even it really will have to speed up, but I'm sure there will be some level of it. But on the other hand, as people are spending money on this, it's certainly going to be shipped up. It's not efficient, but as we create more efficient ways of getting into space, the companies that you mentioned, as NASA doing additional things, NASA's not going to shoot anything into alcohol into space, but you have more capacity to get more mass into space, it will become more practical to do it. And you'll have more volume going up. So it's not just going to be squeezing a small bottle in your spacesuit. you'll be able to bring larger amounts, for your tourists, for your people who are working in space. And so that's the key. But we'll see. Maybe by, if Elon can actually move the rate he's talking about, that's a faster schedule than I would expect. But, maybe by 2050s, we will have a more volume to the alcohol being created. But we'll see. It really depends how quickly this develops, but it's going to be definitely part of the culture as tourists and others go up, and even if it's brought from Earth.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say that Jamie didn't just ditch us. Her internet crashed. So
it's fine.
That's good. I was feeling insulted. I drove her away.
Oh man. So I think it's interesting because we didn't really get to talk about it too much, but in your book, you also talk about the history of alcohol production, which predates, recorded history. For as long as we've been writing stuff down, we've been talking about getting drunk. And I just think it's interesting, like when we start talking about this space travel, how that tradition is just going to continue. Like right now we're in the heavy research and development phase, I guess. This isn't really public accessible. It's very only accessible to people that are in the industry or people that have millions and billions of dollars. But yeah, I just think it's really interesting how the tradition that is drinking alcohol, which even predates modern humans, like our ancestors were drinking, or not drinking, were eating fermented plums long before we were evolved into our modern version of humans. And it's just, I don't know. Going back to Space Odyssey 2001, it's almost like the big black, I can't think what it's called, not the obelisk, the...
Yeah, now you made me, because I was thinking, you made me now think obelisk, and now I'm blank there. Talking about.
But that thing that continuously, like from apes that are learning how to use bones as weapons, all the way up to us modern apes now throwing our space stations up into space and getting drunk up there as well.
Well, yeah, and this has been part of human society from the beginning. And this is one of the justifications. I thought it was very important to do that history of alcohol and civilization to show that, that this has been such an integral part, and for the good and the bad. People focus on the bad elements of alcohol all the time. And yeah, there is a dark side of alcohol, no question. I try not to minimize that. But there's also been a lot of good that's come out of it, and through ceremonies for bonding, just all through, but as well as agriculture. I mentioned in the book, there are many scientists that think that the desire to have a drink may have influenced the advancement of early agriculture more than the need for the desire to eat. And so it really helped advance civilization all the way along through all these different mediums that we know about. But so this context was important because we've been drinking alcohol, and it's been a really critical part of our civilization. Not every, some societies, some elements drink less or, shun alcohol. Sure, you don't know anything about that. But that's fine. But overall, it's played a large role in human culture. And so we're not just going to stop drinking when we go into space. Some people will say, of course, we're not going to drink. People going into space will transcend all the vices of the earth. No, they won't.
Never, ever.
And so it's a very
humans
to look at that. This will be a continuation. Traditions will change. Alcohols will change, but it's going to continue, and we have to think about it. And because it's going to be a reality, it's also, I think, it's a legitimate area of study. And this, NASA is very sensitive on it. And I know a lot of people at NASA, and a lot of them love this, but everybody's a little squeamish about talking about it in public.
Yeah.
But it is a legitimate topic, just like, as I mentioned earlier, sex in space is also, because it's going to happen eventually, well, it's already meaning the alcohol has. I don't know about the other one, but the alcohol
They don't document that as much.
Yeah, but we have had no studies on how humans metabolize alcohol in space. We think they metabolize it fine through anecdotal tales because we know that people have consumed alcohol in space. However, it's still been in small quantities. And so we don't really have any formal studies to see how the body, well, as I said, deals with it in microgravity, or certainly not in lunar gravity, although there's been one example, but once again, not enough to really impact. Yeah. Obviously, Buzz is still around, so it wasn't deadly drinking on the moon.
Still around, punching flat earthers in the face.
Yeah, so that's I think it's an important thing to look at. How it put it into context and all the different ways it's impacted society and helped develop society, but as well as in how it's been dealt with in science fiction and fiction in general. That science fiction writers who have been very effective at predicting future technologies. Sometimes it's hard for science fiction writers to stay ahead of technologies. Unfortunately, not always in space exploration, but other things like computer technology. Yeah. Everybody just assumes when they're writing that there's going to be alcohol. Even the people who are not fond of it just assume there's going to be alcohol.
Oh man, that's wonderful. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time, unfortunately, because I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've absolutely loved talking with you about this. But I've read Chris's book. It's absolutely amazing. I recommend it 100%. You can get through it in a week or two. It's not too bad. And if you like talking about manufacturing alcohol in any sense, it's got a lot of anecdotes in it. Chris, do you want to tell us where we can get your book and what are the other things that you're doing right now?
The easiest place to get the book is Amazon. Just search on Amazon. You can, that's the most efficient place of getting it. It's sold through most online vendors, but but so
Amazon,
yeah. But other things doing, as I mentioned earlier, I'm the CEO of Explore Mars, a nonprofit, and we run the largest annual conference focused on sending humans to Mars in the world. Normally, we do it in May in Washington at the National Academy of Sciences. That, of course, for various reasons we all are familiar with, didn't happen this year. However, we have now shifted. It's going to be entirely virtual on August 31st to September 3rd. The Humans to Mars Summit will take place with a lot of the top people at NASA, industry, but we'll also have people in all these different industries as well. And so you'll see, we try not just to have the scientists and the engineers, but we try to look at all these other areas, kind of like alcohol in space, and we have dealt with that. But, we've had people talking about agriculture, artificial intelligence, AI, virtual reality. We try to look at all these different areas that also are going to contribute to exploration, including STEM education as well, the entertainment industry. So that's coming together well. And if people are interested in attending that, you can go to exploremars.org. And we have a lot of other projects and STEM activities. And we've been doing a weekly webinar series, although we're taking a break right now as we lead up to H2M, but we're still likely to do some of them. And we occasionally do these, we usually on Tuesday evenings do Drinks with Explore Mars, whereas similar to this, we share our drinks each evening, and we usually have a special guest, an astronaut, or somebody who's doing really exciting work in the space community as well. So we're pretty busy, but Humans to Mars Summit's the biggest thing coming up for us in the near future.
That's really cool. We'll put a link down in the videos so that people know where to go for that. Like I said, this has been absolutely wonderful. I enjoyed reading your book. I've enjoyed talking to you. You tell wonderful stories. So
thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us some of your time today.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me on. It was a lot of fun. And I hope the rest of your pie and beer day goes well.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I'm sure it will.
All right. Well, cheers.
Cheers. Cheers. See you guys later.